Hello. Today we're going to be looking at how the Iranian hostage crisis affected President Carter's re-election hopes. And to, first of all, have a little bit of background. We need to look at the Iranian Revolution, but we really need to start back even further than that. Early on in the Cold War, the United States found itself really in competition with the Soviets for influence in many parts of the world, and Iran was no exception. We ultimately became very distrustful of the prime minister of Iran at the time, named Mohammad Mossadegh, and we ultimately orchestrate his overthrow. This is really kind of largely, the coup that overthrows him is largely carried out by the CIA. And ultimately, we placed the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, in power on the throne of Iran. And so the thing we liked about the Shah is he was very Western friendly. He cooperated with our hopes and our ideals. He was very pro-Western. This was seen as being a good thing. We went to great lengths to make sure that we kept him in power. And ultimately, despite the fact that he squandered a great deal of the nation's wealth on lavish parties and on his own personal wealth, not really taking care of the people, all of this bred a lot of anti-American resentment in Iran. Well, but most Americans were, of course, completely unaware of this, and eventually this leads to a revolution in Iran where the Shah is overthrown. And so in 1979, this revolution takes place, and this leads to the Shah fleeing Iran. And then the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who is a religious leader, he's a Muslim cleric, he really kind of comes in and becomes the leader of the revolution and the leader of the country of Iran. And so this is really kind of the background. And then as we head later into 1979, this is where the hostage crisis takes place. On November 4th, 1979, exactly 1 year to the date prior to the 1980 presidential election, a group of students seized the American embassy in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and they hold the Americans there as hostages. Now, many of them believed that this initially was going to be a fairly short ordeal. They were making a statement. They didn't see this as dragging on for very long, but ultimately, the Shah, of course, he's fled the country, ends up actually being admitted to the United States to receive cancer treatment. The Ayatollah ends up kind of endorsing what has taken place, and the whole hostage crisis then takes on a whole life of its own. This thing becomes a much longer, drawn-out deal, and ultimately, one of the demands of the hostage takers is that they want the Shah returned to Iran to face charges. They want him extradited. During this time, every night on the nightly news, we would have updates on what day it is. Today is day 63 of the Iranian hostage crisis. And they would talk about efforts to bring this hostage crisis to an end. And the next day, it would be, day 64 of the Iranian hostage crisis. And this thing would just keep going on. And, frequently we would see footage of Iranians protesting and burning American flags in the streets. And so like I said, many people were wondering, well, why do they hate us? What did we do to Iran? Now, of course, most Americans were not aware of U.S. policies that had ultimately supported the coup that toppled Mohammad Mossadegh, their elected prime minister. Most Americans weren't aware of the repression that had taken place under the Shah. We just couldn't understand what we had done to them. Carter continues to try to negotiate the release of the hostages. He's unable to do so. This crisis just keeps going on and on and on. Then finally, he plans a rescue attempt. And ultimately, there are 52 Americans that are being held hostage as we headed into the 1980 election. And so in April of 1980, Carter approved a rescue mission known as Operation Eagle Claw. And this plan, they're going to bring in helicopters during the night. And the plan is actually to, in effect, come in through the roof and evacuate the Americans via helicopter out through the roof of the embassy. And so during the night, there's some miscommunication, things get a little chaotic, and one of the helicopters collides with one of the troop transports, or maybe it wasn't a troop transport, I can't remember, it might have been a refueling jet, but at any rate, there's a collision between one of the helicopters and one of the aircraft. They collide out in the middle of the Iranian desert during the night. And after that, they call off the operation. 8 service members are killed. The whole operation becomes a tremendous embarrassment for the president. And so once again, this just becomes indicative of the feeling that many Americans have. Carter's been unable to deal with the economy. Now, he's been unable to bring this Iranian hostage crisis to a conclusion. All in all, the hostages end up being held for 444 days, more than a year. The 1980 election, of course, comes and goes. So literally, they're at 365 days into this when the 1980 election takes place. Literally 1 year after it started. Carter loses the election, really pretty much in a landslide, to Ronald Reagan. Carter continues to work for their release all the way up until the day of Reagan's inauguration. And he manages to negotiate the release of the hostages, but as kind of a final insult to Carter, the hostages are released about 20 minutes after Reagan is sworn in as president. And Reagan is given word that the Americans have left Iranian airspace, and he's able to make the announcement. So, and of course, this becomes a huge moment for Ronald Reagan as our newly sworn in president to be able to make this announcement that here's Carter, who not only lost his re-election bid because of his inability to bring an earlier solution to this, but has to deal with the final insult that he does, even though he's finally been able to broker this deal to get the hostages released, he doesn't get to make the announcement.